knows the pitfalls that lie ahead.
Richard Ravitch, co-chair of the State Budget Crisis Task Force. Thank you for joining us from New York this morning.
My pleasure.
That's all for Washington Journal today. Thank you for joining us. We'll go to the House floor now. They're going into the morning hour. Legislative business to be tackled today includes the Federal Reserve Transparency Act and the Preserving America's Family Farms Act.
House will be in order. The chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., July 24, 2012. I hereby appoint the Honorable David Rivera to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 17, 2012, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each, but in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 5 minutes to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, for years the United States has used drones to track terrorists overseas, catch outlaws along the border, and other lawful purposes. But now thousands of drones are headed to the homeland. The FAA plans to allow expanded use of drones to operate nationwide by the year 2015. It is estimated by 2020, 30,000 of them will be flying in American skies. Yes, Mr. Speaker, the drones are coming. Who will operate these drones and what will be their mission? Could it be a suspicious government agent who thinks someone looks kind of funny? The EPA bureaucrat to monitor somebody's farm and watch Bessie the cow graze in the pasture? Or a nosy neighbor who wants to make sure someone's shutters are pretty and the flowers don't violate the homeowners association rules? Or could it be a legitimate and lawful and legal purpose of drones that doesn't violate the right of privacy? These are the kind of situations Americans face as we enter this uncharted and unprecedented world of drone technology. Congress has the legal obligation to ensure that the Fourth Amendment rights of private citizens are protected in this new drone world. You see, Mr. Speaker, the Fourth Amendment says this: the right of people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. No warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. The Fourth Amendment limits government intrusion into our lives. The Constitution limits eavesdropping, snooping, and spying on American citizens. And while there are some legitimate uses for drones domestically, such as monitoring forest fires and floods and hurricanes, tracking an escaped bank robber, and other law enforcement uses, it's up to Congress to limit their use so that the Fourth Amendment and the right of privacy are protected. That's why I am introducing the Preserving American Privacy Act. Now is the time for Congress to act, not in 2015. With the increased technology of surveillance, Congress has to be proactive in controlling drone use to law enforcement and also protecting civilians from the private use of drones. This bill will ensure the privacy of private citizens, that it is protected by establishing guidelines about when and what purposes law enforcement agencies and private citizens and businesses can use drones. I repeat, this bill will ensure the privacy of private citizens, that it is protected by establishing guidelines about when and for what purposes law enforcement agencies, private citizens, and businesses can use drones. First, it would prevent the FAA from issuing a permit for the use of a drone to fly in the United States airspace for law enforcement purposes unless it is pursuant to a warrant and an investigation of a felony. This would apply to state, federal, and local jurisdictions. The warrant exceptions and exigent circumstances rules that are already the law of the land would be the same as those applicable in the state, federal, or local jurisdiction where that surveillance occurs. It would also prevent the FAA from issuing a permit to any private individual for the use of a drone for surveillance of a U.S. citizen or the property of a U.S. citizen unless that person under the surveillance has consented or the owner of the property has consented. There may be some other lawful exceptions as well. And lastly, this bill would ensure that no evidence obtained from the use of drone may be used in an administrative hearing. Americans expect their constitutional rights will be protected at any time in our history or our future. So Congress must decide when drones can and cannot be used to ensure constitutional safeguards. This decision cannot be left up to government agencies, special interest groups, or others. Mr. Speaker, technology may change, but the Constitution does not. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Speaker, there's plenty of blame for the near collapse of the economy over the last 5 years. Greedy, even criminal business behavior, lax or non-existent oversight, regulators asleep at the switch. Clearly there were some reckless consumers and a failed political system. But as instructive as the post-mortem might be, it's more important to avoid a repeat performance. What should we do? I would suggest we simplify, regulate, and prosecute. Let's begin by reinstating the Glass-Steagall Depression-era bank regulation that helped promote stability in that industry. It would be a small step in the right direction that the era of deregulation unfettered is at an end. I hope we can move to performance-based regulation. The Dodd-Frank bill had many important and valuable features, but I fear that it is at risk of becoming a bureaucratic nightmare. We do need to regulate. The cozy, light-touch, genteel, some would say diffident approach that assumes that the gentle people in the financial industry will self-police must be a thing of the past. We should provide the various regulatory authorities with adequate staff and budget. We should pay them properly so that they aren't a training ground to be hired away by much higher salaries from the industry they're supposed to regulate. We should have high expectations that they will do their job, and then we should back them up and not undercut those efforts. Finally, we should prosecute. Sending people to jail will send a message. All of the people in American prisons collectively have not stolen as much with guns as the American public, our pension funds, our businesses lost in the near meltdown of the economy. Every time somebody illegally profits from a financial transaction, somebody else loses. Crooks, whatever the color of their collar, should be held accountable. To make this happen, the public needs to focus some of their frustration to make this an issue in the election. At a time when politicians and special interests are making strange and outrageous noises, here's a real issue for them to address.
Gentleman's time having expired, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. WALBERG, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for the record, America's businesses and innovators do not need the administration mandating how they run their companies. Yet it regularly does, and in the form of burdensome and costly regulations. We all share in the responsibility to find the balance of making sure employees have the safest working conditions possible while allowing them to have a job to come back to every day. Burdensome, onerous regulations place such a heavy toll on businesses that hiring slows and they are forced to start cutting from their workforce. Part of protecting employees' jobs is making sure that business they work for is still able to grow and create more good-paying jobs for those in Michigan and across the country. Over the course of this Congress, I have had the opportunity to speak with numerous small businesses, owners and workers who state unequivocally that they'd rather Washington hand out less regulations and more certainty. According to a Chamber of Commerce Small Business Outlook survey from earlier this year, nearly 80% of small businesses say taxes, regulations, and legislation make it harder for them to hire. That's because small businesses are forced to pay on average $10,000 per employee per year in order to comply with excessive regulations. The Small Business Administration has reported that when added up, those costs amount to $1.75 trillion annually, which is enough money for businesses to provide 35 million private sector jobs with an average salary of $50,000 per year. Truly, Mr. Speaker, the price of red tape is the loss of American jobs. Because of these regulations, the United States is also losing its competitive edge. According to the Global Competitiveness Report for 2011 to 2012, the U.S. fell to the 5th most competitive economy in the world, down from 2nd place when President Obama took office in 2009. And the reason stated by the report, and I quote, more burdensome regulations. I ask my big government colleagues, what's wrong with being number one? Regulations are important, and businesses should be held accountable for how safe they keep their employees. But how much is too much? So far this year, the Federal Register has run more than 40,000 pages of regulations that range from burdensome to downright ridiculous. It contains such provisions as multiple hospital claim reimbursement codes for injuries caused by parrots and burns from flaming water skis. We need regulatory reform that cleans up the system, removes duplicative regs, and wipes out burdensome, excessive rules. My Republican colleagues and I in the House have passed dozens of bills to pull back the government's regulatory arm. We passed the regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny, or REINS Act, which would require both Congress and the President approve of all major rules created by federal agencies. We also have passed regulations that discourage, or rules that would discourage any regulation that will have an annual impact of more than $100 million, resulting in major increases in costs and prices, or impose a significant negative effect on competition and jobs. This week we'll vote on H.R. 4078, the Red Tape Reduction and Small Business Job Creation Act, which would prevent any federal agency from taking a significant regulatory action until employment has reached 6% or less. House Republicans remain committed to growing the economy and requiring congressional approval for any regulation that has significant impact on the economy or burdens small businesses and cost jobs. We must stop allowing unelected bureaucrats to enact job-killing rules with no checks or balances. By preventing these kinds of job-hindering proposals, we can give job creators more certainty about what rules they can expect. Small businesses are our country's real job creators, creating 7 out of every 10 jobs. To protect these jobs in our country and Michigan, I will continue to fight for less red tape here and in Washington and more jobs in our homeland. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman's time having expired, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, these are tasks that we often do not find welcoming. I rise this morning to pay tribute to a public servant among us, someone who served this House as a staff person, a chief of staff in my office. I rise this morning to pay tribute to Kathleen Kathy Wilkes, whose memorial service will be held this afternoon, July 24th, 1:30 p.m. at the Alfred Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. Kathy died suddenly last Saturday. The good news is that so many of her friends were able to fly in, as I was able to do from Houston, and to be with her in those waning hours. One would always ask the question, why? And there is no explanation for someone so full of life, so ready to serve, so willing to help, to lose their life so suddenly, even as she was so active the week of her death. Kathy had a wonderful history, coming from Ohio, touching down in Pennsylvania, in Houston, in Washington, D.C. How often can what we call a civilian touch the lives of so many states and so many people? Kathy pulled herself up by her bootstraps, supported herself and became a nurse, and was so good at it as well, continued to nurture people, maybe in the spirit of Florence Nightingale. That was not enough for Kathy. She continued to put herself through school and ultimately graduated and became a lawyer. That brought her to Houston, Texas, working for one of the major corporations there, but it brought her into my life so many, many years ago. There she was a light as well, interested in helping, befriending not only my husband and myself, but my two little ones, Erica and Jason. Boy, did they have a buddy in Kathy Wilkes. She loved to do things that children, much smaller, much younger than herself, enjoyed. Just a fun, loving person. And then, of course, traveling to places around the world, and, of course, embracing friends. As she came back to Washington, D.C., to become the Chief of Staff in the 18th Congressional District, what a light she was in the office, bringing in great talent and other young people who were nurtured, counseled by her, tutored, and made great. And then, of course, what a partner in legislation. Through the ups and downs of the 90s, through the impeachment proceedings, as I was a member of the House Judiciary Committee, all of these tough times, Kathy was there. And then, of course, we were able to do something quite great, if I might say so myself. This place, this house, was built by slaves, the capital of the United States of America. But as we looked around a few years past, there were no statues of African Americans, less than African American women. I passed legislation along with Secretary, then Senator Clinton, to place Sojourner Truth, a person who had been an abolitionist, a suffragette, a slave, a mother of 13 children, who had seen most all of them sold into slavery. Kathy worked without ceasing to ensure that that statue was sculptured, that we had the opportunity to place it historically in the United States Congress, and it was honored with 2,000 people coming to see the placement of the Sojourner Truth statue, having then Secretary Hillary Clinton and First Lady Michelle Obama, and of course the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. What a wonderful day and occasion in tribute to the hard work of Kathy Wilkes. And so it is befitting that I rise today to express the deep pain that so many of us feel, friends from all around the world even, but certainly in this nation, friends, as I said, from Ohio to Pennsylvania to Washington, D.C., to Texas, many of whom will be able to come today, others of whom will celebrate her in Houston and in Ohio. One would ask why. She is deserving of such. In the backdrop of such terrible tragedies that have faced us in Aurora and places around the world, as we mourn the loss of so many in the occurrence of last Thursday, I stand here today to say that I know that if Kathy Wilkes was alive today, she'd be somewhere trying to help, to nurture, to assist my office, to be of help, even as she is no longer a Chief of Staff, but really a former Chief of Staff. That is simply the way Kathy Wilkes is to a mother, her son, and of course her granddaughter, and the many relatives and many, many friends. We have lost a good friend, but I can see her now taking wings. Farewell, my good friend. You have served well and made us proud, but more importantly, you have given of yourself. May you rest in peace. I yield back my time.
Gentlewoman's time having expired, the chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, last Saturday I had the privilege to speak to well over 200 retirees. Many of the retirees are veterans of our previous wars for this country. They wanted me to be there with them to discuss sequestration, their benefits, and what do I think is going to happen, which I could not honestly tell them. And none of us really seem to know until we get back after the election in November. But, Mr. Speaker, when I spoke to this group of retirees, I took this poster down, and I had it on a stand like this one. It says, "Funding the Enemy, How U.S. Taxpayers Bankrolled the Taliban." And I told these veterans that it was time to get our troops out of Afghanistan. It was time to stop sending money to a corrupt leader named Karzai, and time to bring the troops home and spend the money here in America on our own people and guarantee the benefits for our veterans which they have earned. Mr. Speaker, I got a strong applause from those people who have served this nation and their spouses. This took place at Jacksonville, North Carolina, which is in my district. Camp Lejeune Marine Base is in my district. And many of these in attendance served in the Marine Corps, the Navy, a few in the Air Force. And they agree with me, it is time to stop spending money digging a hole that has no end to it, known as Afghanistan. Mr. Speaker, in the critique on this book, Funding the Enemy, I read, "One of the most candid behind-the-scenes example of war reportage, this book contains a host of voices that spell out the chaos and mayhem of America's longest war." Mr. Speaker, it is a no-win situation. I'm a history major from college, but I'm not an expert on history. But everything I've ever read about Afghanistan, the end is always the same. No nation has ever gone to Afghanistan and changed anything, nothing at all. And Mr. Speaker, speaking of mayhem, yesterday in the New York Times, and I quote the article, the title of the article is "Top Afghans Tied to 90s Carnage, Researcher Says." Activists say powerful figures are blocking an 800 report of carnage in the 90s by many of those that are leading Afghanistan today. I don't know why there's not more outrage from Congress. Anytime we have a debate about Afghanistan, it's a few Republicans, a few Democrats stand up, and we might get 10 minutes, but that's about all. 10 minutes? Spending $10 billion a month, young men and women losing their legs and arms, and 10 minutes is all we're going to debate the policy in Afghanistan? That in itself is crazy. In this article, it further states, the American embassy here has been another source of objection to the mass grave report. American officials say releasing the report would be a bad idea, at least until after Afghanistan's 2014 presidential election. This has been a failed policy. It should have stopped after Mr. Obama got bin Laden. That's the reason we went into Afghanistan, was to get bin Laden and al-Qaeda, who were responsible for 9/11. Well, he is dead now. Al-Qaeda has been dispersed all around the world. It is time to stop this failed policy in Afghanistan. And I would say to the embassy that does not want this report out, why? Why do you continue to play this game with the American young men and women who give their life and limbs in Afghanistan? Why won't you be honest with the American people in Congress and say, bring the troops home, stop spending money we don't have? The money is actually borrowed from China, Mr. Speaker. We owe China $1.3 trillion. We can't pay our own bills, but yet we're going to borrow the money from China to send to a corrupt leader named Karzai in Afghanistan. And, Mr. Speaker, the subtitle of this book, How U.S. Taxpayers Bankroll the Taliban. It's the Taliban that are killing Americans. Mr. Speaker, with that, I will yield back my time and ask God to please bless our men and women in uniform. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time having expired, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I rise to express my heartfelt sorrow and condolences to the victims and their families and the community of Aurora, Colorado, a great tragedy. Words are inadequate to describe it. And it's certainly a reminder to everyone that no time is promised to any of us, and we never know what will happen in the next second or the next minute or the next hour, certainly the next day. So we give praise that we are able to wake up this morning, come to the floor of the House and talk about an issue that is going to take a lot of time to heal. But while we are healing, we have work to do in this Congress. You see, the assault weapons ban in place for a number of years, 10 years actually, expired in 2004. And after the expiration of the assault weapons ban, it's been open season. And now I know that there are people who hold the Second Amendment dear, and it is established clearly in law that citizens have a right to bear arms. Beyond that, the Constitution is silent. And so it leaves it up to us to address issues concerning the reasonable regulation of that right. Should we not have any regulations, or should we have regulations that are reasonable? Now, I just heard some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle talking about the numerous bills that we will be considering this week having to do with stopping regulation in their tracks in all areas, whether or not it be child safety, food, drugs, cars, safety, whether or not it be air, water, food, drugs. I've heard the talk that regulations stop jobs from being created. It's one that I disagree with, but nevertheless we will be considering it today. And but there are some regulations governing the affairs of people that are reasonable, and that includes restrictions on who can bear arms and what kind of arms they can bear. To say that we have and we should have no regulations on weapons, particularly weapons of mass destruction, to me is unwise. I don't understand why someone who has a gun in their home for protection needs to have a 100 a magazine that's capable of rapid fire 100 rounds in a couple of minutes or in a minute. I don't understand why someone needs that kind of firepower to protect their home. I know people love to go hunting. I myself will one day have the opportunity to do that. I've never done it before, but I respect those who wait until hunting season begins on their particular prey of choice, and they exercise that right. They get a lot of joy and satisfaction out of it, and also bring home some food. I can't disagree with that, and we do need to cull our deer population and other populations. We have reasonable regulations on that, but you don't need a AK-47 to go deer hunting. Am I at my 5 minutes? So time goes by very quickly, but I think you all understand what I'm saying, and I'm going to yield back my time. Thank you.
Gentleman's time having expired, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for 5 minutes.
Request to address the House for 5 minutes and revise and extend.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to honor the life and memory of Pennsylvania State Representative Anthony Melio, who passed away on Thursday afternoon. To his family, friends, and neighbors, he was known simply as Tony, Pop-Pop, and Uncle Tony. In the Pennsylvania State Capitol, he was known as a hardworking and honorable state representative. Having served his country in the Naval Reserves and working as one of the first employees in the United States Steel Fairless Works in Bucks County, Tony's story is the story of my hometown of Levittown, Pennsylvania, a town of dignified and hardworking people. Tony Melio was a man who built his political career on bringing the community together with his contagious smile and his warm personality. He embodied the spirit of public service during his time in Harrisburg. As the people's representative from Lower Bucks County, Tony carried out his duties with dignity and perseverance. His commitment to his family and his community were the hallmarks of his service. A man of great faith, Bucks County has lost one of its most well-respected and beloved public servants in Tony Melio. I, like so many, had the privilege of calling Tony a friend and a neighbor, and my thoughts and prayers are with the Melio family in this difficult time. And I thank the United States House of Representatives for stopping to remember this dignified public servant this morning. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, President Obama continues to pursue an energy agenda that is contrary to his all-of-the-above rhetoric. There is no better example than this administration's recently released 5-year offshore leasing plan. According to the nonpartisan Congressional Research Service, the plan proposes a mere 15 lease sales over the next 5 years, which is the lowest number since 1980 when CRS began tracking that data. Instead of allowing the development of America's vast offshore oil and gas resources, the plan effectively imposes a moratorium on most development, a moratorium which Congress lifted nearly 4 years ago. Mr. Speaker, the plan blocks drilling on 85% of the Outer Continental Shelf. Effectively, states which sought federal approval will have to wait another 12 years before any production is possible. Under current law, Congress has a 60-day review period to replace the President's plan. Last week, the House Natural Resource Committee passed H.R. 6082, a plan that will allow more development of our energy resources. Instead of the moratorium of a none-of-the-above energy policy, we should responsibly develop all of our resources for the long-term benefits for the American people. Mr. Speaker, the American people deserve affordable and reliable energy. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. DREIER, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to discussion an issue which I hope we're going to be addressing in the coming days. There's a great deal of confusion about the possibility of our passing PNTR for Russia. Some are laboring under the impression that this is a reward to Vladimir Putin and Russia, and in fact the opposite is the case. We know that Vladimir Putin, in fact many people say they look at him and what they're reminded of is the KGB. We know that Vladimir Putin, according to many reports, is attempting to reassemble the former Soviet Union. We know that he has grossly violated human rights. We know that they have a massive bureaucracy, crony capitalism, and a very corrupt court system. That's why, Mr. Speaker, that's why it's very important for us to make sure that we pass Russia PNTR. According to the Wall Street Journal, in an editorial last week, they made it clear Vladimir Putin does not want us to pass the Magnitsky Act, which is part of Russia PNTR, and they go on to say that he probably would be just as happy if we did not have PNTR. Why? Because based on overwhelming votes that took place in the last 2 weeks in the Russian Parliament, in the Duma, the lower house, and the Federated Council, the upper house, overwhelming votes, Russia is going to become a member of the World Trade Organization. I personally believe that that's a good thing because it'll take a great step in the direction of forcing Russia to live with a rules-based trading system, to address those issues of crony capitalism, a corrupt court system, and a massive bureaucracy. But, Mr. Speaker, having said that, I think it's important to note that we've seen action taken here in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the Senate Finance Committee, and we've seen a great deal of enthusiasm focused on the Magnitsky Act. Now, what is the Magnitsky Act? It's legislation that is named for Sergei Magnitsky, who was a whistleblower who focused on basically corruption that existed within the tax reporting system, basically tax fraud. He reported on that, and he was in prison. He died in 2009. And, Mr. Speaker, what happened very sadly, according to most reports, is that he was beaten to death. Well, what does this legislation do? Something, again, Vladimir Putin would be virulently opposed to. It actually penalizes anyone who was involved in those human rights violations against Sergei Magnitsky. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a good thing, and at the same time, in passing PNTR, we will say that the 140 million consumers in Russia will have access to goods and services from the United States of America. Under the measure that's passed both houses of the Russian Parliament, as I said, overwhelming majorities, it will go into effect. It will go into effect within the next couple or 3 weeks. And what we need to do, Mr. Speaker, is we need to recognize that the world will have access to that consumer market. We need to create jobs here in the United States of America. We need to open up that market for U.S. goods and services. And so, Mr. Speaker, when this vote comes forward, don't believe that this is somehow a reward to Vladimir Putin and the people who are leading Russia. This, in fact, is a great benefit for workers in the United States of America, businesses in the United States of America, and a benefit to the consumers of Russia who will have access to our goods and services. And I want to congratulate, in closing, Mr. Speaker, my colleagues Billy Long and Tom Reed, who, along with 71 other of the newly elected members, sent a letter that indicates strong support of this effort. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. DOLD, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly want to echo the comments of the esteemed chairman from the Rules Committee about Russian PNTR, the effects that it's going to have for American businesses, and it really is going to allow us to compete more on a level playing field. Mr. Speaker, I rise today also to recognize Bell Flavors and Fragrances of Northbrook, Illinois, who will celebrate their 100-year anniversary on July 25th, so tomorrow. This is indeed a remarkable achievement and something that we should celebrate. Mr. James Heinz and his team at Bell Flavors and Fragrances are innovating and selling products that satisfy the needs of their customers. And their customers, Mr. Speaker, are literally all over the world. Headquartered in Northbrook, Illinois, Bell Flavors and Fragrances has sales offices in 40 countries around the world and tailors its products to meet the regional demands of its consumers. Bell is one of the many small businesses in my district who have utilized the Export-Import Bank. They've utilized it this year to support its export operations. As a member of the Financial Services Committee and a strong supporter of the Export-Import Bank, I am proud that here in Congress we were able to work together on a broad bipartisan basis to reauthorize the Export-Import Bank. So many of our small and medium-sized businesses rely on the support of the Export Bank in order to more efficiently and effectively compete in the global marketplace. Mr. Speaker, we don't always spend enough time, effort, or energy here in Washington, D.C. celebrating business growth and success. So today, on behalf of the residents of the 10th District of Illinois, I want to congratulate the wonderful people who make up Bell Flavors and Fragrances on their centennial anniversary. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until approximately noon today.
And the House comes back for legislative